Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Let the filibustering begin.
Welcome to Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to our latest podcast interview from the Edinburgh International Film Festival. We've been so lucky to meet with some amazing acting talent and behind the scenes names, and I'm excited to share our conversations about the movies, the festival and cinema with you. Today's interview is with film creator Steve Sanguedolce. Sanguedolce's documentary, The Land of Not Knowing, is an experimental one that brings together four artists who speak with refreshing honesty about how thoughts of suicide and depression have dominated their personal and creative life. Shot on 16mm and hand-coloured, the flow of images create a dreamlike and poetic visual response to the tales and experiences spoken. I hope you'll enjoy our discussion, and thanks again to Steve for giving up his time to meet with me. Enjoy the show. So Steve, thank you so much for coming on to the show. I really appreciate it. I saw Land of Not Knowing yesterday and I was absolutely blown away. I work in mental health myself, and I thought it was a brilliant representation of the problems that people face and bring to people with depression and their worries, and I just thought it was a fantastic representation of that, and yeah, you should be very proud of yourself.
Wow, thank you. It's nice, because it's kind of a dark film. It's maybe for some people it's a harder film because it's not your usual typical documentary style. It's a little more poetic, I guess, or metaphoric. So it's nice, and to be able to reach someone on that kind of emotional level, I think is really important. Because sometimes I think the form of film or the language of film gets in the way of the actual idea or message. And so it's really nice to hear that, it reaches people who may or may not watch this type of, I'm going to call it alternative work, because essentially it's about, depression, art, and struggle, I think, is really what the film's about.
What inspired you to go down that route of, like, as you say, a non-traditional documentary, a lot of archive footage, a lot of made-for documentary footage? What made you think this is the best way to represent these people's amazingly kind of open and honest discussions?
I think maybe when I left school 30 years ago or more, that I realized it would be really hard to replicate what Hollywood does. It would be really hard to do kind of cover songs of films, and I thought it might be easier to just kind of reinvent the language. I know it sounds ideal and naive, and it's probably both, but I thought it was more important to try to establish a more kind of personal way of telling stories. And I liken making movies to how we dream, that we all kind of see and feel and experience differently. And so this attempt with a more abstract kind of palette and hand coloring motion picture film, because a lot of the footage is actually colored in buckets by hand. It's all analog coloring, not digital. I thought that would be easier to do than it would be to try to, establish that kind of more generic forms of doc or fiction or experimental kinds of work. So it was really more of a choice I made 30 years ago to pursue stories in a more personal way, in a more evocative or dreamlike manner, and to try to place the viewer inside those worlds. And so it also, the subject matter that I choose, this one's particularly about struggle and art and suicide, but I think this kind of palette really fosters that, because it is a little more abstract, it is a little more dreamy, it's a little looser in its kind of formal presentation. So, to answer your question, it's really about an aesthetic choice I made a long time ago to try to find a way to make movies that was both unique and accessible, that I can make, I could afford to make. And two, to pick subjects that seem appropriate for this form of storytelling.
What was the genesis for you of that kind of inspiration to go down this route? Was there a movie that you saw or a bit of advice where you thought, this was the moment where I thought, this is where my style began, and I thought, I don't want to do something traditional, I want to do something that's mine?
I watched a lot of European art films, but I remember being in Germany and watching Derek Jarman's Last of England and Angelic Conversation. And it was kind of mind-blowing that, one, he can make these kinds of abstract feature films with very little dialogue. Mine are all word heavy, but his were really simple, sparse in terms of language, and beautiful. and it really it kind of opened up a world. I mean, after watching, Godard and Fellini and Rossellini and a bunch of other European artists work in ways that were slightly outside of mainstream kind of narrative cinema, I think his work, and I was also influenced by people like Stan Brakhage and American avant-garde, Canadian avant-garde, where films were really a lot more expressive. And I thought that was a way in which I could kind of gain entry into this, difficult world of making work, which is really 95% commercial and 5%, made by artists.
Absolutely.
It's not that the commercial work isn't viable or valid or important or significant, because I love it, but it's a different way of making work. Maybe it'd be the difference between being a violin player and playing, solo or playing in a symphony. There are different kinds of approaches to a similar instrument, and I thought my way made more sense for me. And in that, I could also keep a practice alive.
Yeah.
I can do it daily. It was a cheaper way of working because I was buying non-traditional film stocks that were 1/10 the cost of camera stocks, and I was coloring it myself, so I could create other kinds of worlds in that regard.
Yeah. So then, for when you start a process like, say, Land of Not Knowing, how long does it take from kind of genesis to completion to? Well, I suppose it's still in probably kind of on the go. It's just starting to show at festivals and to kind of a general release. What's your kind of time scale for?
I made my last 3 or 4 films have been all over an hour, mostly feature films, and they each take me about 5 years to make. I would say it's probably a 3-year process, because once I finish a film, I try to put some energy into distribution, because it doesn't really move on its own if you don't. And then I take a little bit of time off just because it's so draining, and it's tough because you make films. Sometimes I call my work invisible cinema, films that nobody sees, right? But probably 3 to 4 years, and every 5 years I put out a feature film. But I do everything on it. I'll collect the voices first, and that's more like an animator might work, where the voices are the first thing I edit. And in some films I've had final mixes before I started shooting. That's really like animation. In this film I started with the voices and try to compile a narrative and an arc, a trajectory, and find what the story's about, what the characters are, how they interconnect, because I interviewed about 8 people for this film and ended up using 4. And then, cutting, shooting, cutting picture, and doing the sound. So it's a 5-year turnover, but it really takes about 3 to 4 years for me.
And you were saying that you interviewed 8 people and you cut it down to 4. What made you go with Emily, Megan, Marina, and Mike? What was it about them 4? And how did you conduct those kind of the interviews for putting into the film? How did you get so much honest and touching information out of them?
I think 2 parts to that. One is when you put a microphone in front of people, they're not intimidated. You forget it's there. It's this machine. You put a camera in front of somebody, and there's a whole different kind of consciousness. There's a self-consciousness, almost a fear and apprehension. And I mean, these people, 3 of them I knew quite well. 2 of them I knew really well, and the other 2 I got to know, of course, in the making. And so we have a history, but I always say I'm born in Canada, Toronto, and my family's Italian, so I'm a recovering Catholic. And it's ironic in that my studio's turned into this kind of pseudo-confessional, where people come in and say, I want to tell you my story. And I almost don't have to ask any questions. They just walk in and start telling me stories. So it's turned into this place where I've had people phone me and say, Steve, I want to tell you my story. And as much as it's a kind of honor, there's a great weight to it, because people tell me really dark stories, and some are revealing secrets they've never told anybody. And I feel this incredible responsibility. One, because there's this great trust in them telling me the story, and then the real challenge is the fact that it's really easy to present people as being angelic or demonic, like that kind of 2-dimensionality that you see in a lot of film. Is the easy way to present someone, but I'm trying to find, this more kind of 3-dimensional presentation. I made a film about heroin addicts, and it's really easy to kind of shun them and say, it's your own problem. And in my film, I try to give them a kind of voice and try to make them human. So I think the idea is that it's very easy to paint people good or bad, but I think to show a kind of complexity is where the skill lies. And then alongside that, just the added responsibility of trying to be honest and fair in representing people. I always offer to show people the film before I finish it because it is their story on some level. And I've never had any negative feedback. Some people haven't been able to see it till after, but I've never had any, adverse kind of reaction to it because I try to be sensitive to what the intent is and what the kind of, how to represent them in a way that is honest and fair. I mean, it's like I said, it's really the challenge is to try to give them depth and not make them to be villains or heroines.
Powerful responsibility you've got that people are so honest with you and they're giving you kind of their words, their open feelings, and it's to be shared around the world that there's people watching at 11 o'clock in the morning, and it can taking all this on board. And kind of when you make a movie like this, like what's kind of the aim? Is it to tell people's story, or is it to kind of promote mental health? Is it to promote discussion? What kind of would you say one of your main goals out of these sorts of movies are?
I'm a bit naive in that I never really think of audience, and since I've started making films, I always convinced myself that first and foremost I'd make them for myself, and so ultimately, of course I'd like people to see the work, of course I'd like it to get wider distribution, but I never think in that way as a kind of opening kind of approach or process. So really my main intention always is to try to present an idea or a feeling or a space or a place or an experience. If I was smarter and more business savvy, I would think, okay, what's a good way to do this that I could reach a larger number of people or get distribution or broadcast or even theatrical. But I never think in that way, so I always, primarily it's really I need to make this piece, this piece about this particular experience. And approaching it the way I do means there's a limited kind of resources in terms of distribution potential other than galleries, universities, festivals, things like that. But it does mean that I never really have to consider how to kind of please everybody, because I don't know if I'd be very good at that. I don't know if I'm interested in that. And ultimately, I'm only interested in trying to present a kind of space in which this experience lives and be able to reach people. And in spite of its limited distribution potential, it does feel like people do gain entry quite easily because the films are kind of compassionate. They're also compelling in that, you're hearing real people talk about their lives in ways that are vulnerable, open, and raw. And so I take pride in that as much as it's painful not to have, it being shown more than 50 times in the life of the film, or 100 times.
There's one thing that kind of caught my attention when I was watching it, and I was thinking about kind of mental health in the wider perspective, is that it's often put down that men have the biggest problem opening up and sharing their thoughts, their depression. Male suicide rates in the UK are awfully high. And when I was listening to the movie, there's the one male voice and there's the three female voices. Is that something you find yourself when you're putting these things together, that perhaps men aren't as willing to be open about kind of mental health? And what was it from your kind of point of view that why there was maybe three women to one male?
I'm wondering, how many other people were interviewed. I know there was two other men. Maybe there's some truth in that women are a little more able to address it. Not that they're more in touch with their feelings. Perhaps they are, but I think they're more able to kind of communicate it. Men might be a little more guarded, perhaps. Mike Holbohm in the film is phenomenal, very erudite, articulate. He's, spent a lifetime making this type of work. I think what brought these people together for me, because personally I believe everybody struggles with personal health or depression to some extent. Whether it's severe, extreme, debilitating or not is another issue altogether. But I think we all struggle in that regard. And I think what tied these four subjects together was the fact that they're all artists. They're all interested in making work. And I think that adds a whole other layer of, persistence or struggle in life, because art is not typically an easy way to go. No. It's not very rewarding financially. It's you're not only struggling with your work and distribution and art potential, but also with making money and paying rent and being able to live in a way that's comfortable. So I think the gender divide, I think it was just coincidental, because I believe I did interview as many men as I did women, but really looking for people who were, one, a little more articulate perhaps, and then because they had the art element as a kind of commonality.
What was the reaction from the four of them when they saw this movie, where in a way their talks and thoughts and some of their dreams about depression are brought to life so well? Was it a terrifying experience for them? Was it quite a rewarding experience? What was their reaction?
One's a filmmaker, and he was part of the process all the way through. So he watched it and felt really strongly about it, and we'd talk about, what might work, and it was really talking about it as though we were talking about a different film, like he wasn't part of it. The photographer, Marina Black, was kind of pleasantly surprised with how poetic it came across. And, I guess people are always concerned how they're represented, and everybody felt comfortable. I didn't hear from the other two subjects yet. One lives in Syracuse, which is in the U.S. The other woman, I haven't had contact with her because she moved on. But Megan, I haven't heard from Megan. But the two that I have heard from felt really, strongly about it. Really appreciated how they were represented and thought it gave a good rendition of their experiences. Beyond that, I don't really know how people might react to me watching the film. I think if there were some, just from my past experiences, if there were any objections, people would make those clear. But so far, people have felt that their representation was both honest and empathic, and I think that's important too. Because, like I said, it's really easy to, misrepresent people. It's really easy to kind of make them two-dimensional, and I don't think that's the purpose. I think it's to show us all in all our glory and our faults, and regardless of how I move into this film, I always learn an incredible amount from these people, because overcoming such obstacles and life experiences is really inspiring, and it makes me feel like my troubles are somewhat insignificant in comparison. So there's always a great amount to be learned, and a great amount of kind of reverence that I learned from my subjects, just because one, they're so honest, they're so open, they're so vulnerable, and they're so erudite and articulate, and you don't always get that in subjects. So for me, it's always a great learning experience, and it's kind of inspiring to think that they could endure this, and my troubles often are insignificant in comparison.
It's certainly quite humbling to watch that.
Absolutely.
And then, kind of, what's been the reaction when you were talking about showing it on the festival circuit? What's been the reaction from people that perhaps don't suffer from depression? Is it giving them a good insight, or are they coming up to you and talking about it as a piece of art, as opposed to talking about, I've really understood now something? What's been the reaction?
I don't get a lot of comments from people who say they've never suffered it, because I don't think there are a lot of people who have never had moments of doubt or despair. Mostly it's the opposite. I've had at almost every screening someone say, I considered suicide and even acted on it once, and your film was a great rendition of what that experience was like. At my last screening in Ireland, a young man came up to me and said, today, ironically, is my 1-year anniversary of my suicide attempt. I said, I'm really sorry to have to put you through this. He said, oh no, this was a really wonderful experience to be able to see where I came from. So mostly it's the other end of the spectrum where, like I said earlier, I think most people do suffer, to some extent. Some more severe than others, of course, and some more debilitating than others. So mostly I get comments from people who have experienced it. Almost every screen I get someone, I attempted suicide, and your film really does give a sense of that despair and that struggle. So it's, that's kind of inspiring. But the sad and scary thing is this is way more common than we may imagine or like to admit.
Absolutely. And then, kind of as a final question, that you were saying that it's got a limited run and distribution, but if people wanted to kind of seek out this movie or kind of talk to yourself about kind of some of the themes brought up in the movie, where could people kind of find the movie and reach out to?
I have a website under my name.com, under stevesanguedolce.com, The film's not on there because I'm at this point now where I think I spend so much time getting a great image. I work with hand coloring. I do, 6-channel sound, surround, and to put it up on, I know now YouTube has changed and it's got high quality. You can actually put surround. I haven't, but my older films, some of them are online, and they look like crap and they sound like shit, and I really hate that. And for me, like, the experience is, it's the difference between looking at a piece of art in person as opposed to looking at it on a slide. Yeah. And so, I'm kind of reticent to say go and watch it on a bad computer on your, iPhone.
It truly lends itself to the cinema as well when you watch it yesterday, when it's got that ambience, and I think that it really works well with kind of I found it quite a dreamlike experience. I kind of found myself just relaxing into it, and it's just, I think it's the fact that we watch it on a big screen and it's so dark as well, and it's like you don't have like a phone or like someone's there coming that. You truly immerse yourself into it, and you've got no choice but to be exposed to it.
And that's changing, like the way we're watching films is changing a lot. People are watching them more on their laptops, and people are watching more through headphones, and the isolated kind of religious experience of going in a room and watching the white light is kind of diminishing. I mean, it still exists, but that's what this film is. These types of films are ideal for. So I'm kind of reticent to just pop it up on YouTube and then have somebody, watch it on an iWatch or something stupid like that. It still works, I think, because the voice alone carries it. But I think to get the full experience, and sound really matters to me, like the tonal quality, not just what the information is, but just the feeling. So you can feel the kind of subtle rumbles, or you can hear that little, tinkle at the top end. And those things you lose a lot in bad playback. So it's kind of restrictive in terms of where it can be seen, but I do think it's like looking at a painting live as opposed to seeing it in a book. Absolutely. There's a different kind of physicality, tactility, visceral quality in watching films like this in theaters. If it was just a talking head documentary is about information and essay based, fine, I have no problems, watching it online and stuff. But having said that, it means, it diminishes potential. So I have DVDs and things that are available that I think give a better rendition, because at least the sound is fantastic. But yeah, I'm trying to figure out that whole notion of what to put online. And I'm also at a point where, artists really don't get compensated. So I'm almost thinking maybe it's better to post everything up for free. Just make it like a free archive, come and experience the work, hopefully get something from it, learn something, walk away with something, be enriched by it, as opposed to trying to make it this commercial endeavor, which, I think that left us with the Medicis in the Middle Ages, right?
And finally, are you looking forward to like screening it with an audience tonight and the kind of an Edinburgh crowd? Are you excited for that?
Yeah, every time you sit in a theater, there's a different kind of energy, and different theaters and audiences bring different things. So it's always curious because you kind of feel the film as en masse in some ways, as a group, and there's a kind of hidden energy that is not. You never know what to expect, and like the easy examples when you can feel when the whole audience is riveted, or you can feel when the whole audience is kind of fidgety and just hoping to move forward, and that's a really nice sensibility to experience. So going to watch, especially in festivals where people are there just to watch films, it's not mandated. It's it's not like you're showing it in a university class. It's not like it's just happens to be on TV and people are skipping through channels. So I always like that part of it, is trying to figure out how it reached and how this audience reacts to it.
Well, fingers crossed it goes as well as my screening went for the other day and stuff. And thank you so much for coming on, and you made a real important piece of work, and I hope it gets the audience it deserves. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much. That's great. I'm really glad you liked it.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.